Good morning. We're going to make a start. Welcome along to Taming SOA deployments with Windows Server AppFabric. So my name's Steph Sewell. I'm an architect based here in Auckland, a company called Adirant. We build software for the legal and professional services market. Joined on stage by Peter Goodman, who's one of our lead engineers. And we've been working with .NET 4 and Windows Server AppFabric as part of their TAP program. So we've had early beta releases of this software. Been working with it for the last 18 months, and we've integrated it, and we build our software stack on top of this stuff. Okay, so the agenda for today is, first of all, to have a look at some of the challenges that SOA presents us, particularly in the operational and deployment aspects, but we're also going to talk about scale-out. We're going to have a look at the on-premise scenario. Now, this is Windows Server AppFabric, so this is looking at hosting services on-premise in IIS. There are also technologies, all the Azure platform stuff that's going out to help you host stuff in the cloud. But this session is going to be about on-premise hosting. So we're going to spend a good portion of the talk in demos, which I'm sure you'll be glad to hear. And we're going to look at the features that AppFabric provides us. So in particular, we're going to be having a look at monitoring. So how can we look at what our services are doing? We're going to be looking at two aspects of that in particular, health monitoring and troubleshooting. We're going to be looking at workflow service hosting. So yesterday we had a session on workflow, and we introduced this idea of being able to write your WCF services as workflows. And to be able to do that, we need to host those services somewhere. And AppFabric gives us a very powerful service hosting infrastructure, and we'll show you the features of that. AppFabric also comes along with tooling that integrates into IIS, so we're going to show you how that stuff works. But everything that you can do in IIS, you can also do via PowerShell. So we're going to spend a bit of time looking at that PowerShell API that's provided. Now, just how many guys actually use PowerShell, just as a matter of interest? Okay, so it might be worth doing a very, very quick run-through on PowerShell as well. Okay. What we hope to do is actually show you how to do a complete automated deployment via PowerShell. So we'll take a bunch of DLLs, we'll deploy them, we'll configure IIS, we'll configure AppFabric. We'll make sure everything's up and running, and we'll show you how you can fully automate this. And then finally, we're going to show you how you can go beyond having to write scripts to do this, how you can model a deployment, translate that into PowerShell, and actually have a model-driven approach. Okay, so SOA challenges. First challenge really is, so SOA, you've got a whole bunch of services that form your system. Those services are quite often running on a number of different hosts. You need to be able to have a look at your system as a whole. You don't want to be having to drill down into event logs and monitoring for each individual machine. You want to get an overall look at what your system is doing. When issues occur, because you're on multiple machines, tracing that issue across multiple machines is usually very hard. You want to be able to correlate across the different hosts that are running your solution. Service hosting and scale out, you want to easily be able to author your services. So you can either do it in managed code with WCF, you can write it as a workflow, and you want to be able to host those services easily. So you don't want to have to worry about the infrastructure platform. You want to be able to just concentrate on your business logic, hand that off to a container, and have the container manage all of the platform level details for you. One of those details is the ability to scale out. So you want to be able to grow or add additional resources into that environment, into that solution, without affecting the uptime of that solution and without having to kind of write any code that knows that it's running in that type of environment. And so Microsoft called this the kind of the elastic scale out. Deployment is actually quite a challenge in an SOA world because you have all of these different parts that operate together, and you have to actually deploy them out onto a number of different servers using a number of different technologies. So you might be installing into IIS, you might have services that are running as Windows services under the SCM. You might be integrating into Active Directory, you might be using MSMQ. It's a whole bunch of different technologies that to be able to do a scripted deploy is actually really quite complex and quite time consuming. Now, one of the challenges that we have with deploying our software is the prerequisites. So before we even put our software down onto a platform, we want to make sure that that platform has the bits on it that we need, so that it has IIS, it has MSMQ installed, so that MSDTC is correctly configured, that the OS version is correct, it has the right level of service packs and so on. We found a lot of time being spent manually doing those pre-rec checks, so you really want to automate those. And when we consider deployment, we're considering the full life cycle of deployment. So it's not just the installation, it's not just getting you up and running. You've also got to consider, well, how do we repair this stuff? How do we check that what we did put down, and when we check the original prereqs, that they're still satisfied, that someone hasn't come along and changed config that's broken us? If we have bugs, which we all ultimately do, how do we patch? How do we easily get updates put onto the system? And then also, how do we remove? So we don't want to make taking our software off a hassle. So we just want to walk through a scenario to show you what a typical deployment for us looks like. Now, really the whole point of this slide is really just to show you that it's kind of complex. Okay, we've got a whole bunch of moving parts here. We've got services deployed into Windows services. We have services in orange, which are provided by the platform. So we have AppFabric monitoring, AppFabric persistence, message queue, and IIS. There's two databases that come along with AppFabric. We need to get those out. We need to get those deployed. We're now writing our services to be hosted in IIS. And so we've got a whole bunch of services hosted in IIS, but we still have some legacy ones that are hosted as Windows services. We have services that are written in managed code as WCF services, and we have services that are written as workflows, and they're hosted in the AppFabric workflow service host. A lot of parts here to manage. So this is, if you like, the 10,000-foot conceptual view. If we then go and have a look at, well, how do we actually deploy this? What does our infrastructure look like? This is one of our small test environments. And so we have two database servers here because we're still running some of our databases on SQL Server 2005. We've got the AppFabric databases running on SQL Server 2008. We have a bunch of services being load balanced across a farm of machines. Those machines are load balanced using NLB, the built-in load balancing software in Windows Server. And just because we can, we've also got another server out there which has the messaging role on it. So we're saying, okay, well, maybe that's a service that's pretty heavyweight in resource requirements, so we're going to dedicate a machine for that. So to be able to actually support this and let the platform take care of a number of these issues for us, Microsoft has released a set of extensions called Windows Server AppFabric, which are free. They're available for download. They were released, I think, at TechEd in this year in the US. Runs on the the 2008 platform, and it really comprises of kind of three areas plus a management API. So we're going to look at two of them today. So the one at the bottom, I'll just cover that off first. There is this distributed cache that comes with Windows Server AppFabric that was previously codenamed Velocity. I'm not going to talk about that today, but that is part of the Windows Server AppFabric kind of components. What we're going to look at is the monitoring service that allows us to monitor and essentially look at gather the information that WCF and WF services emit. We're going to look at workflow service hosting and how to scale out those services. Now, normally your WCF services are quite short-lived in terms of the duration of the service call. With workflow services, you now have the ability to do long-running services, and with that comes quite a management overhead. And we're going to show how the workflow service host takes care of that for us. And as we said, we've got a PowerShell API and some extensions to the IIS manager in terms of its user interface, so we want to show you that as well. So let's start off with monitoring. So what we have is, with AppFabric, there comes a new Windows service, which is the event collection service. And this service sits listening to all of the services that you have hosted in IIS, which are emitting ETW events. So that's event tracing for Windows. It's a very high performance, lightweight event tracing. It's gathering those up and pushing them into a SQL server for you. So if you've got your services spread out over a whole range of machines, you can take those, point them all at the same monitoring database, and you have a single location for where that monitoring data gets captured to, which means you can now report on it. It's a SQL database. You can write your own queries. You can write your own reports. You can do a whole bunch of analysis of that. That data is also used by the UI extensions to IIS to give you a dashboard of what's currently happening in your entire environment, not just on that server, but on all the machines that are pointed to that monitoring store. There's really two kind of use cases that the monitoring is targeted at. One is health monitoring. So as your system is running, it's just giving you a view of, okay, well, how healthy is it? You know, am I under load? Am I getting stressed? How many calls are going through? How long are those calls taking? Which machine did that call get serviced by? And so normally that's the level that you would have the tracing sitting at. Because, of course, the more tracing that you have running, there is a performance overhead. It's also worth noting that ETW is not guaranteed message delivery. So if the server is under very, very high load, it may start dropping events. And so if you're using this for audit purposes, ETW and the out-of-the-box provider may not be the way to go. And we actually don't use ETW for our business tracking. We use MSMQ so we can get guaranteed delivery of messages. Once you see that a problem is happening, you can kick over into troubleshooting mode. So you can increase the level of capture in the events, and you can also introduce this idea of end-to-end tracing. So what this gives you is a logical view of all the calls from a single user as it goes out across your different services. A little token gets added into the message header in WCF, and this has been in WCF in version 3, but AppFabric actually makes it easier to work with. And so we have this token going out, and it allows you to trace through all the various service calls that compose a logical service call from the perspective of your user. This stuff is hosted in IIS. We'll see that very shortly. ETW is used for the capture. You can set up your own profiles. So I think you get 5 out of the box, but if you want, you can add your own profiles in there so you can tune exactly what information gets captured. And you can also raise your own custom events. And so you can start raising business level events or business data as part of your service infrastructure and have that captured into the same monitoring store. Okay, so let's demo that.
Alrighty, so what I've got here is basically a kind of fictitious scenario. I've got a workflow here which is hosted in IIS. That workflow is going to just create some data and then call this build report. Build report is a WCF service which generates a string saying, look, this is a report for the, well, parameter that you give me, and returns that back. So it's kind of really just a stub. So what we're trying to show basically here is a distributed scenario where you've got one service calling another, right? All right. So let's look at what AppFabric gives us to be able to monitor that. So first thing you'll notice when you go into IIS with AppFabric installed is up at the top you get a new section. So up around here you see AppFabric, you get the AppFabric dashboard, endpoints and services. Endpoints and services list well the endpoints and services, and the AppFabric dashboard is really what we're interested in here. Okay. So I'm working on a really awesome resolution here, so bear with me. All right. Basically, you get 3 sections. The top one here is persistent workflow instances. So this is live or suspended instances of workflows. Not really involved in the monitoring. It actually goes off the workflow persistence store rather than the monitoring store. So we'll kind of come back to that later. Middle section is WCF call history. So this is any messages that are going to and from your WCF services. You'll see things like completed errors and throttle hits, etc. And you actually see some grouping on there, which is pretty cool. Last one is workflow instance history. So this is a historical view over workflows instances. So it shows you any workflows that are errored, how many have been activated, and how many have completed. Alrighty. So let's look at what some of these events look like. We're going to WCF call history. So you'll see that at the moment this is kind of troubleshooting level. I'll show you that level in a minute. And from here we can see that each one of these is going to represent a single call to our service. You get the emit time, a call duration. This is actually quite handy. So you get an overall kind of health perspective of your service. When we talk about this distributed scenario, you see at the end something pretty useful. You can see what machine actually serviced that request. So if you have a farm, you're actually hosting this service on multiple servers, then because you have a central monitoring store, you can actually look across that in one IIS instance. You don't have to go to all those separate machines and try and kind of collate this information together. It's all going to go into one place here. All right, so let's look at what workflow looks like. How does it?
What network boundaries? Are you thinking of subnet boundaries or domain boundaries? What sort of boundary? You basically have a choice of which store the data goes into. So if you want to put it into a central store, you will have to open up your firewall from your DMZ into that database. You might want to have separate databases and then collect them later. Okay.
All right. So let's look at this workflow history. So workflow is a little more interesting. You can actually see that, well, let me just go back there a second. When I went in and looked at the individual completions, each one of these represents a workflow instance. If I click on a single instance and I look at this tracked events, it's actually giving me more information about the history of that workflow in chronological order from bottom to top. So each one of these represents a step or an activity in my workflow, and I can actually see what paths I took through my workflow. This is actually kind of cool when you're looking at workflow instances. All right. Now, we said there's an event collection service. So the ETW events are raised by your WCF service or your workflow service, and it's the event collection service you see here that's actually pulling those together. It then puts them into your monitoring database. So let's just have a look at that. I've probably got two of them set up here. It puts them into a staging table in the AppFabric monitoring database. And basically then there's some jobs. Enter doesn't work. There's some jobs that then run periodically around, I think it's every 10 seconds by default, which are going to take those events out of those out of that staging table and put them into the normalized tables for creating by the IIS runtime, or you can run your own SSRS SQL Server Reporting Services reports over these. All right. So I mentioned there's different monitoring levels that you can choose here. So in these web applications in IIS, you can right-click one. You'll see a new menu item called Manage WCF and WF Services. So this is the AppFabric extensions into IIS. And then you see you've got a configure option. They've actually put a lot of features in here to kind of make things a little bit easier, a lot easier than they used to be. So kind of extending that app config or web config UI that used to be in IIS. So making things easier than a lot easier than it used to be. So if you look at the monitoring here, you'll see that we have a slider. So we could basically change that monitoring level from basically off, errors only, health monitoring, which is the default. End-to-end monitoring, that's that monitoring that's going to put this unique ID on the first WCF call that's made, and it's going to pass it to every single WCF call or workflow call in that logical operation. Last one's troubleshooting, and it's actually just a little more noise. All right. So you're getting a lot more events. Instead of just getting things like activity completed, you're getting activity started and activity completed, these type of things. Okay, another thing to show you here is the section at the bottom. If you've ever tried to switch on WCF message logging in the app config, you probably don't remember how to do it. You probably go back, Google it, and try and do it again, right? So they've actually made this a little bit easier, so you can easily just click the enable, choose a file, etc. Pretty useful for your troubleshooting.
It's worth noting that to get your dashboards populated in IIS, you want to make sure that you have that sitting at health monitoring or greater. Anything below health monitoring and the dashboard doesn't populate.
Alrighty. So that's very useful. You can see these default events that are coming out for your WCF services and your workflow services. But what if you want to emit your own custom events, right? Let's say you want to actually get maybe log some business data out of that. For workflow example, you want to log some information from the state as your workflow. So let's show you how you can raise these custom events. Right back to my project. If we look at WCF first, so I have this operation. Now, the code in this sample, you have to write this custom provider that's going to allow you to raise this ETW event. You can get this code off either one of our blogs. I think probably we lifted it from MSDN. I'll have to check. But I'm pretty sure Ron Jacobs has done a version of it as well. So basically just allows you to raise an event from a WCF service. Now, in WCF and workflow is slightly different. WCF, you kind of three types of events you can raise: information, warning, and error. And you can put some payload in there. So you'll see when I'm raising this event, I'm raising an information event. And my payload is basically just a string. All right. If I want to raise it from workflow, you see on my workflow I've got this log activity. So my log activity is a custom code activity. I raise a custom tracking record from within there. So there are a bunch of tracking records that are raised by workflow by default. Custom tracking records, how you define it? Well, custom one. You give it a name, put some data in it. So the data is basically just a string object dictionary. So I'm adding in message, and I'm taking the message that somebody's passed to my activity and using that as a payload for this ETW event. So basically how tracking works in workflow is a tracking provider that then passes this off. So there's a default one that comes with AppFabric. That tracking provider will raise the ETW events. You can write your own custom tracking providers. It's not really the purpose of this talk. Okay, let's see what those two events look like in AppFabric. I'm going to run this up because it takes a little bit of time. I'm just going to show you one that I generated earlier. Okay. So a little star for space. You'll see, basically this is the end-to-end monitoring I've got switched on here. So this is going to show me, I'll just give you a quick clue. See that E2E activity ID? So in the first WCF call, that's been assigned and that's getting passed through to all the other calls. Go down to the very bottom. You'll see that the very first message received from transport and service 1 is my workflow. I keep going up. You see, eventually I should reach my, where are we? Just a second. So what do you have to do to get a combined view of the WCF and WF events is actually look at the related events. So when I was looking at the events for my workflow, I have to go view all related events, and that's then going to give me the overall view here. So if I scroll down, you see eventually I get to my report builder, which is my WCF service, and I get this user-defined information event here. You see that the payload is in here, and it has a report was generated for blah, blah, blah. So that's the business message that I raised from my WCF event, and it's going into the central monitoring repository. Now I also have a log activity in here. I find that one. So it's a custom tracking record raised by my log activity. It has a tracked variable, and that tracked variable is the message that I put into that custom tracking record. So you can see how you can actually add kind of business-sensitive information into your workflow instances, WCF services, and get that out to central repository and monitoring. All right, there is something else you can do within workflow to get custom custom data out, and that's creating a custom tracking profile. So you've seen in these monitoring profiles that we had here, where are we? We had health monitoring, etc. You can actually find your own custom one for workflow. So to do that, you can go into services, go into your workflow service, click configure, and under monitoring, you can add new, and basically you set up a tracking profile. Now that tracking profile, you can find documentation on MSDN on how to set this one up. Give you a quick clue, this one is one I created earlier. It's going to listen to all events that have been raised in the workflow instance. So these are all the started, completed, so the actual workflow instance lifetime events. Then activity events, I'm only listening to when the activity has been closed, so it's been completed, except when the name of that activity is email report. And then I'm going to log out into those tracked variables, the city and report. So those variables from within my workflow, I can say take those, put them as tracked variables inside the monitoring store, and just spit those out every time this instance is run. So that's kind of useful, again, to get business information out after the fact. All right, so you haven't added your own log statement or whatever, or your own log activity. You can actually get this stuff out later on from your workflow. All right.
So one of the thoughts you might be having is, well, that's really cool. I've got tracked information. Wouldn't it be really great if I could replay that using my workflow design surface? So I could actually go back down through the process and see which branch I took, see what data was applied. And you can. There is a sample that's posted as part of the WCF and WF samples. And if you want to have a look at how to do that, there's actually very little code involved. So you can have a look at actually providing a visualization of what the history of that workflow execution was. So the second part of the AppFabric feature set that we want to talk about is how do we do our service hosting and how do we scale out those services? So for WCF, standard WCF services, this was all provided in the 3.0, 3.5 stack. What we get with .NET 4 is the ability to do this with workflows, with workflow services. Now, you can use workflows to create very short-running services where you just have the method call, very short-lived, sub-second. It's doing a piece of work for you, updating a database, just as you could with WCF. However, where we see workflow services making a lot more sense is where you have long-running processes, which are taking hours or days or months to complete. And so it's kind of unreasonable to expect that that process is going to be in memory the whole time. You're going to have machine failures, you're going to be applying updates to the server. And so we need a way to take the current state of an executing workflow and save it to disk. And the workflow service host takes care of all that for you. So you don't have to worry about it. You just author your workflow, and the workflow service host is configured so that when the workflow idles and is at a point where it doesn't have any work to do, it'll get put down to disk, unloaded from memory, and then there's a workflow management service that's a Windows service that's sitting monitoring all of those idle services. And when an event comes in or when a timer expires or some other wake up for that process comes along, it'll bring that state back into memory and start running it again. One of the nice things here is because the execution environment for a workflow is stackless, process agile, thread agile, machine agile, so long as the machine that you bring that instance back onto has the workflow definition, it can continue running it. So it doesn't have to be the same machine that it was running on previously. And this is what allows you to scale it out across a web farm, or an application farm, sorry, in this case. So you've got a bunch of machines, and you only want one of those machines to be running that instance at any time. And so we need this idea of an instance lock. And an instance lock is a pessimistic lock that says, I own that instance for a period of time. I'm the only thing that can work on it. it's possible that the instance will get loaded into a host and that host crashes. So the workflow management service is also responsible for managing those instance locks. Those instance locks have timeouts. It'll go over every 30 seconds or something and have a look and see if there are any instance locks still held. It'll go and try and talk to the host. It'll try and establish whether or not it's still running. And if not, it'll release that lock, which then allows another machine to come along and try and service that request. So next thing is, okay, how does that affect my workflow design? Well, you need to be quite careful about when you persist your workflow state, because you don't want to have it running for so long that you've done a bunch of work, the host crashes, and you lose it all. So part of your workflow design is thinking, okay, well, when do I want to persist this? And so your first pass might be, well, I want to persist before I do perhaps an operation that relies on a third-party service, because I don't know if that service is going to be up or not. The persistence model is extensible. So, and it's also, by default, out of the box, you get persistence provider for SQL Server 2008. If you want to use anything else, either you have to find someone who's written one, or you have to go and write your own. And while it's possible, as you can imagine, it's quite a lot of work. So out of the box, you're kind of forced onto the SQL Server 2008 platform. The persistence model is extensible insofar as you can also write code that goes into that persistence chain. So when your workflow persists, you can have your own code injected into that persistence pipeline, if you like, that allows you to do additional persistence operations. Now, when the workflow persisted, what you're looking at really is an XML document. And you want to perhaps have, well, your workflow will have data in it that's meaningful in a business context you might want to be able to query against. Now, querying XML data inside a relational store is not the most efficient. So there's a concept of a promoted property. So what you can do is take your workflow variable, mark it up as a promoted property, and it then gets persisted in the relational store as a first-class concept in the relational store, which makes it much easier to query against it rather than having to dig down via XPath into persisted XML. So let's have a look at some workflow services.
Alrighty, so let's look at some of those hosting options that we have inside AppFabric. So I right-click, this is my workflow web application. So if I right-click on it, go to Manage WCF and WF Services and go to Configure. You see under the workflow persistence, this is where I'm specifying the database that I'm going to store the state of my workflow to. All right. There's also workflow host management. Enable instance control basically means that I can walk up to this thing and, basically pause it, so suspend it, resume it, cancel it, terminate. The unload instances when idle. So in long-running workflows, you have typical idle points. So you have pulses of execution followed by, some wait for something to occur. That could be a time-based thing, so you can get a delay activity, drop that on, and say, in 5 hours, I want you to wake up and do some work. So that's an example of an idle point. Another one is, if you're waiting on a service call, so you set up an endpoint, you have a receive activity there, and you're expecting somebody to call back in to continue the execution of your workflow. That's another idle point. So in those cases, you get automatic persistence. So what happens is it persists the state of the workflow. And here's, in this case, it'll unload it after 60 seconds. Now, if you're using a web farm, that instance log is going to become a bit of a problem if you've got a 60-second wait. So you want to set that right down to 0 if you're sitting on a web farm. So if you've got multiple servers hosting the same workflow definition, and you're getting, somebody could obviously, it could start on one server, and then whenever it idles, it'll wait 60 seconds. In the meantime, somebody else is coming in server B trying to continue that workflow, and you really want to set that down to 0 so you don't get that overlap. Okay. Action on unhandled. The persistence is when idle. We don't actually use it. It's automatically done when you unload. Action on unhandled exception. The default is abandon and suspend. That's pretty good for most people. That means whenever there's an unhandled exception in my workflow, just drop it like a hot potato. Don't try and do anything with it, and mark it as suspended. So what that means is nobody else, none of the servers in the farm will try to pick that thing up because it's marked as suspended now. Okay. Let's go back to my workflow. Now you see what my workflow does. Basically, I begin an instance of the workflow. I pretend that I'm setting some variable within it. And then I do a persist here. So in this case, this one I've idled. So I'm going to actually explicitly persist my workflow because I'm about to do something risky. In that case, I'm actually going to call this report builder service to build my report. So I know that I'm going to do something inherently risky, so I'm actually putting in a persist point there. Then after we get the report, we log and we email it. Let me just run this up. I'm just using the WCF test client, so you can point this at any WCF service, including a WCF workflow service. And it will, in absolutely no time at all, bring you back an interface in which you can call the operations on your service. I've got two of them here because I've enabled two protocols. So I just call begin, because it's asynchronous, it just returns immediately. Then what should happen? It should go off, it should call my build report, log, and then email. So let's check on email. And this is your report. So that's all well and good. But what happens when that report builder service goes offline? So I'm using a feature of IIS which basically says that if you put an app offline.htm in your web app, it's going to pull the whole app offline. It's just so that when you upgrade a web app, you can pull it offline in the meantime. All right, so now when I do it, still got my client open, just invoke another instance. This time, I shouldn't get another report. If I go into AppFabric, come back to this section that we ignored at the start, which is the persisted workflow instances at the top. So you'll see I have one suspended instance. And under suspended instances, I get them grouped by exception. In this case, I'm getting a server too busy exception. So I click on that. I'll see my instance. What we're going to actually do is start to dive into what's, sorry, I'll just look at this errors for a second. This is something to note if you're looking at workflow services. The default error in here is very, basically the initial message is that you don't get a stack trace or anything in here. If you want to go in and look in more detail, you go into the tracked events and you'll get this workflow instance unhandled exception record, one of the last things that would have occurred in your workflow. That's going to have errors which is going to contain the stack trace, etc. So just a note, if you're looking at workflows and you're looking at tracking events, go in there and find more detail. Okay, so I'm going to bring my service back online using the cunning rename. I go into the suspended instance. I can right click, and this is that instance control tick box we've seen earlier on. This enables me to say resume. Now that command gets put on a queue, and the AppFabric workflow management service is going to pick that up and decide to resume that instance. So you see it goes out of the queue, and I get my report. So now we've seen that you can actually have long-running workflows. You can have the persisted to disk, you have an unhandled exception, and then somebody come in later on, fix the problem with that dependent service, and just resume that instance.
Okay. So that's monitoring. Some of the aspects of the workflow services, long running, being able to save them to disk, having them come back in, being able to recover from failures. We're going to have a look at how we actually automate some of this deployment of this stuff. And to do that, we're going to use PowerShell. Because fundamentally what we need is a way that we can invoke commands on a remote machine. We want to be able to do what Unix has been able to do for a very, very long time, which is have remote shells. And now, shipping out of the box with Windows 7 and Windows Server 2008, we have this capability in the form of PowerShell v2. Some very nice features of PowerShell, and I'll kind of walk you through a couple since not many people seem to have used it. One is this interop with existing .NET and COM objects, in that from a PowerShell command or from a CLI you can start invoking .NET components directly. And so you can start reusing all of the code that you've already built up. Because you can do remote service invocation, you basically need an endpoint sitting on that target server that is sitting listening for remote commands to come in. And there's two ways you can do that. There's this concept of a fan-out model, which is a Windows service based model. So you have an administrator's workstation, and then you have multiple servers that you're looking to administer, and so they kind of fan out from the administration kind of workstation out to all these servers. But there's another model, and this is where we kick over into how you can administer this stuff via the cloud, and that's a fan-in model. So you can take the PowerShell endpoint for remote management hosted in IIS and have multiple administrators fanning into that single endpoint. So if you think of a tenanted application or like Exchange, something like that, and you have administrators that want to administer their section of the application, they can do that using this fan-in model. Now you can go from PowerShell to .NET, but you can also go from .NET to PowerShell. So in the system management automation classes, the ability to construct a PowerShell object, pass it a PowerShell script, and have it execute that for you. Now this remote command is built on WS management. So it's an open standard, it's standards based. You're basically sending SOAP messages over HTTP or HTTPS. So your client doesn't even have to be a Windows machine. It can be anything. So this works in heterogeneous environments. And because it's based on HTTP, it's then firewall friendly. You can have it run over port 80. Okay, so let's have a look at PowerShell. So I'm going to start off just with some very, very quick, simple demos. That doesn't look so great. Let's bump up the... sorry, just the resolution a little bit here. Let's go silly 28. How does that look? Can you guys read that? I'm only going to spend a couple of minutes. So the first thing, if you're not used to it, I mean, it's a command line interface. That's great. So I want to get help. Type in get help. The idea with PowerShell is that they're all verb-noun pairs. So you say what you want to do, and you say what you want to do it to. If you want to get help about a particular command, you say get help. And there's tab completion as well for the commands. So here I'm going to get help on the invoke command. And it brings me that back. So let me just resize this window a little bit. Which gives you all of the various parameter options for the command. Now I'm not going to spend too long in here because I'm going to show you some scripts that will automate your deployments, but one of the very cool features of PowerShell is the idea of a managed provider, which allows you to treat any hierarchical information as if it was a file system. So at the moment we're talking to the file system, I've got a $C prompt, but if I do import module, web administration, what I'm going to do is load in the PowerShell scripts that allow me to administer IIS. So I can now go IIS : treat IIS as a file system. Oh, and I'm going to do ls. Now, for anyone who's used to a Unix shell rather than the Windows shell, ls just lists the current contents. And it works because PowerShell has this idea of aliases. So whether you're coming from a Unix background or from a Windows background, I can use ls, I can use dir, or I can use the slightly odd PowerShell command of get child item. So you can guess why we use the aliases. But they all do the same thing. In fact, if we do get alias, you get a whole list of them. Okay. So we're looking at PowerShell in IIS. Do an ls, I can see my app pools and my sites. I can drill down into my sites. I've only got a single site set up, which is my default website. I can drill down into that, and I can see all my web applications that are set up on this machine. There's a whole bunch of different providers. So I can also do, for example, look at my certificate store. So if I do ls-cert, you can see that I've got a current user and local machine certificates. What other interesting ones are there? There's the registry. You can actually drill down into the registry straight from the command line because it's the managed provider for the registry. Okay. And because it's a shell, it does the normal things like pipes, and it also has a for each, so you can actually iterate over a collection of objects. Now, rather than doing that through this, I'm going to pop into the PowerShell ISE. So this is an integrated scripting environment which gives you it's almost like a Visual Studio-like feel for your scripting. So you can set breakpoints, you can inspect variables. And what I'm going to do, now I'll post all of these scripts up onto the blog. And we have a PowerShell basic script here which you can just have a run through, and it gives you, the 15-minute introduction to PowerShell. So it introduces you to variables, how to do conditionals, and so on. But what I want to take you through is a script written in PowerShell that allows you to do deployment. And the 6 things that the script does. First thing it does is it checks the prereqs. So we're going to go and have a look and see if my machine is actually capable of running the service that I'm going to deploy. We're going to do some file copying because we need some files. And then having got those files in place, we're going to go and use the IIS module to create a web application and to create an application pool. We're then going to use the AppFabric API to create a monitoring store and to configure my service to use that monitoring store. Okay. So it's not much fun looking at heaps and heaps of PowerShell scripts, so I'm very quickly just going to run you through some of the things that we're doing. So first thing I'm going to do is check the OS version. I have access to WMI objects, so I'm going to pull back the operating system WMI object. I'm going to check and see what version it is. If it's 6.1, I know that I'm running Windows 7 or Windows Server 2008. So just to see this thing fail, actually, I'll just select a little bit more. If I just run the selection, what we should see is it comes back and tells me that this operating system is not supported because I'm not running 6.2. There's a heap of things that you can do and check in this way. So we're going to check and see that IIS is installed because I'm going to check and see that I have a Dub3 SBC service running. I'm going to do the same for AppFabric. I'm going to see that the event collection service is there and that the workflow management service is there. Because I'm running on .NET 4, I want to make sure that .NET 4 is installed on my machine. So I'm going to jump into the registry, and here's the example of the managed provider for the registry, and go check a path in the registry. And I'm going to go check to see that the RTM version of .NET 4 is installed. Now at each point in each of these checks, I'm basically checking a flag to say, well, if any of these things failed, then say I can't install. So we're just going to write a message to the host and then stop the process. If I'm all good, I'm going to do my install. So first thing I'm going to do is import these modules that I'm going to take advantage of, the IIS module and the AppFabric module. Set up a couple of variables which say the source path is where the binaries are coming from. The install path is where I want the binaries to go to. I've got a monitoring database here. And then this block of code that you can see up just now is basically just doing a recursive copy and setting up some paths if they haven't been created already. So PowerShell is quite terse, but very powerful. This is just file copying. After we've done our file copy, we're going to go and have a look and see if the application pool in IIS exists. And again, it's the same syntax. Because we have this managed provider, I just do IIS:whack app pools, and I can go and pipe the results of that into a where object, and I go check to see whether or not the name equals app pool. And this tells me whether I've got one or not. Slightly strange syntax for null checking. So if mine is not the variable, it's a null. It's just weird. You kind of get used to it after a while, but it took me an awful long time to figure out how you do null checks. Having done that, we're going to set some properties on that. Again, just set item property. Here's the path. Here's what I want to set it to. And we just keep going. So the idea here is we've got maybe 30, 40 PowerShell statements that should allow me to do this full install. So let's give it a go. This is where I get slightly nervous. Do I want to save changes? Sure, why not? I should have probably showed you there wasn't one installed already, but you'll have to take my word for it. So this is now creating the database for me. So this is where my events are going to get tracked into. I'm done. I've got my service installed. So I'm in IIS. You can't see it just now, probably because it's too small, but also because it's not there. If I refresh this, hey, Magic 8-Ball service suddenly appeared. Let's go have a look at it. Let's go into the configure. And we'll see that I've got monitoring set up. I've got it to talk to a Magic 8-Ball monitoring connection set to health monitoring. If I go have a look in my SQL server, and again I refresh my databases, I've now got a new database, a Magic 8-Ball monitoring database. So this is pretty cool. 20 or 30 lines of PowerShell, and I can actually automate the deployment of my services. So if I go back, you'll see there's a number of other tabs here. So the next tab is, we've been running for a while, and something's gone wrong. And what I want to do is just make sure that all my prereqs are still there and any other checks to make sure that I haven't had files deleted on me. Again, just a simple PowerShell script that does that for you. So this just repeats the prerequisite checks that we've already made and then does some tests on the file system. So are there any files in the install path? Is the application pool still there? I can have a PowerShell script that uninstalls as well. Oh, actually, what we should do is prove that this thing works. That would be good. So let's do a WCF test client. Let's add a service reference. And you'll see that I have 2 endpoints exposed. Now the reason I have 2 endpoints exposed is because in my configuration, let me just see if I can quickly find it, I set the enable protocols to HTTP and NetTCP. And so with the default endpoints that WCF4 now provides, just by setting those enabled protocols, the infrastructure kicks in and automatically sets up those endpoints for me. So let's use the HTTP endpoint. Let's give it a question. I know you can't go. Will this work? And let's invoke the service. And even though it's an 8-ball, it actually got it right. So yes, it did work, which is cool. Okay. So we've got this PowerShell script and we can deploy, and I've deployed locally onto this machine. But hey, we've got this idea of a number of machines spread out across our infrastructure and we want to be able to deploy into those machines. So PowerShell gives us that capability. First thing you'll want to do is actually enable PowerShell remoting. So this gives you the default, which is hosting a listener for those requests as a Windows service. So there's a WinRM service, and you can add listeners in there using either HTTP or HTTPS, and you have a choice of ways of authenticating. Now we're going to use Windows authentication, so we're going to use Kerberos in this example, but I'm also going to show you how to do it another way. So we've got the script and we want to run it on a remote machine. Hey, it's as easy as going invoke command, give it the machine name, and give it the script block. In fact, I think I skipped over one. Yeah. So let's do a simple one that is going to execute on my machine here. There we go. It's telling me my machine name is MacBook Pro. So let's go try, and this will be fun because this is over a VPN. Let's go try talking to a machine in our office in Albany. Yes, there we go. Now, what we've done here is not only have we executed that command on my machine, but we've also gone off and executed another machine. So if you've got a load balance environment and you've got that deployment script and you want to execute on a number of machines, you just list them in that invoke command, and it'll go out and execute that script on each of the machines. So you write your PowerShell script from the point of view of it running on the actual target machine. Now, the other thing we can do is, for the cloud environment, it's unlikely that you're going to have a Kerberos infrastructure or be able to use Windows Auth to authenticate those calls. So you can also do it using a number of different credentials. You can do it using digest, certificates, basic auth. So I'm going to see if we can get this to work using basic auth. Now, what we have here is, this is my machine sitting over the shore. And I have a PowerShell web application here that is hosting a web config file. That web config file, I know you can't read it, but it's in my blog, is just a standard web config file that says, okay, I want you to host the PowerShell listener in IIS for me. And so this is what you need to set up the fan-in model. So what I'm now going to do is call that same command. I'm just going to get the machine name out of the machine environment variables. But instead of calling the machine name directly, I'm going to call an HTTPS endpoint. I'm going to use basic authentication, and I'm going to pass through a credentials object that I'm not going to show you. Because, of course, I don't want you to see my username and password. So let's try running this. Oh, in fact, I shouldn't have run that. I should have run the whole thing. There we go. So we've also done this now over HTTPS using basic auth. So this is pretty cool, and this is all the out-of-the-box stuff. But we want to show you something else, which is how you can take this further. Now, I only have 5 minutes for this, so it's going to be a little bit rushed, but we'll see how we go. Before we get there, this is how you call PowerShell scripts from C#. So you create yourself a PowerShell object, you add the script, you call invoke on it, you get back a collection of PowerShell objects, and then you can iterate over those. So by doing this, we can go for declarative deployment. So what we'd really like to be able to do is not have to write PowerShell scripts at all. We'd like to be able to draw out our deployment topography, click a button, and have it all happen for us. Now, behind the scenes, we're going to use PowerShell, but we don't want to expose that PowerShell to the administrator. Now, we're an ISV, so this makes a lot of sense for us because we have to give software over to a law firm and have them deploy it. They're not too kind of happy with PowerShell scripts. So we have this idea of declarative deployment. Now, has anyone used Click Once to do client-side deployment? Okay. Click Once has this idea of two manifests. You have a manifest that is owned by the software developer because they know what they're deploying. You have a manifest that's owned by the installing firm because they know what the publish location is and some other details. So we've taken that idea of client-side Click Once and applied it to the server. So we have the same idea. We have an environment definition, which is a list of servers, and to those servers we map a number of roles. Those roles we define because we own them, and those are our services that are going to get installed. And those roles contain the list of files, the services, the prereqs, and so on. We have a tool that allows them to declare what their environment is, and we have that deploy button, which then goes and translates that into a set of actions that have to occur to make that deployment occur. And that's what we call our deployment engine. So let's have a quick peek. So if I go into Visual Studio, what we have here is DSL. So there's a visualization and modeling DSL toolkit for VS 2010. And from this, we can build a visual design surface, a visual language for deployments. So this is loading an experimental Hive instance of Visual Studio, so it takes a little bit of time. So we've got a very simple language here, application server, database server, server role. And I've got a model here. When I transform this, I get an XML document. And it's this XML document that we feed to our deployment engine to actually make it do stuff. But say I'm kind of running out of resources and what I want to do is introduce a new application server into my environment. I drag it on. I give it some sort of funky name. And then all I'm going to do is cut the role out of there, paste it into there. And as an administrator, I'm now done. Because what I can do is transform this model, this visual representation of a model into XML, and hopefully, if that transform has gone through, you can see that I now have a new server added in. So I have server SV-apo2, which is now being allocated the workflow role, whereas all the other stuff is still sitting on SV-apo1. Now the stuff I'm showing you here, this DSL is where we want to go. What we have just now is this, which is the Deployment Manager UI itself. And so what I've loaded in here is my development environment, and I'm just going to click Validate. And just to show you this stuff working, what it's actually going off and doing is loading in those XML files. So I have those hopefully loaded up here. So this is my environment XML file, and this just contains all of the information about what the servers are, how I want things to be hosted, where the file paths are. This is owned by the installing firm. And then we have a number of role files which declare what the actual deployable units of code are, what services are. So we have prerequisites which look in the registry and look for running services. We have files that have to get deployed. We have services, some are hosted as Windows services, some are hosted as AppFabric IIS services. So what we have with this is a fully declarative deployment model where you just drag and drop. And what this is run through is I click Validate. Let me just highlight some of this perhaps. What we're doing here is we're actually going through and checking the prerequisites. We're checking that the correct files are deployed. Now I do have some errors in here to show you just that we have some notifications coming along. And finally, it's telling me that there's some SPNs missing because my Kerberos isn't set up properly. So this is how you can take that idea of using PowerShell to remotely administer your machines and make it very, very simple to use just using Microsoft tooling. Okay, I think I am actually over, so let's just pop back to the slide deck, and I need to clear the room. But that's declarative deployments. There's some extension, other things that you might be interested in. Please do submit the feedback, and we'll be over in the recharge bar if you've got any questions. Thank you very much.